Rolling on shore, the waves of Daytona sound like those on any other beach. But this roar could just as well be replaced with the roar of an engine. Daytona is synonymous with cars and speed. It was here that men first tested their machines and their nerve against the measured mile. And it was here that the sport of stock car racing began. Appropriately, it was Daytona's own Bill France who founded NASCAR in 1947. France believed that fans would support racing if the cars were similar to the ones they drove on the streets. He was right. Grand National Racing quickly moved from the Daytona sand to dozens of local dirt tracks and eventually to the paved ovals at places like Darlington and Martinsville. But by 1959, Bill France was ready to give the sport another boost by unveiling his masterpiece. The location? Where else? Daytona. The creation, the grandest racetrack ever conceived. It would thrust NASCAR into a new era, a time of superstars and super speedways.
I think the drivers had to be tougher back in those days, driving those cars.
There were others like Curtis Turner and Junior Johnson who, when the green flag dropped, they drove that car as hard as it would go for as long as it would go.
I think somewhere along in '66 or '67, the term the King came along.
The 31-degree high banks of this track, Daytona, are relatively unchanged over the last 25 years. Hi, I'm Alan Bestwick. Welcome to part 2 of the NASCAR story. Back in 1959, only 19 Grand National races had been run on a super speedway. Most of those had been at Darlington Raceway, a 1.25 mile oval. This track is nearly twice that long, providing speeds that were unheard of at the time. No one really knew what to expect, but within a few years, the drivers, mechanics, and even the race fans realized that the super speedway had changed NASCAR racing forever.
When we went to Daytona and France had built the Daytona International Speedway, it was the most fascinating thing that I've ever saw, because the reason of the 33-degree banking and the turns was that you couldn't even walk up them and this kind of stuff. That's what was amazing.
You could out and go come off 2 and look at the backstretch, and it looks like it's a half an hour before you get down the other corner. And it really puzzled a lot of people.
It was just flat. There was nothing there. There was no buildings. There was, I guess, might have had a fence around the inside. I don't remember, and it looked like it must have been 10 miles to the first and second corner, and it was just awesome.
It was early February 1959 when race cars first circled the Daytona International Speedway. The bewildered drivers had only 2 weeks to figure out the new monster track before the first Daytona 500. Soon they were calling it a race driver's dream, the dream of Bill France.
You know, he'd seen Indianapolis and been around that, and that place was just growing bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. I figured if he had something like it, only for stock cars with high bank. And he said back there when they built it, someday these things would be running like Indy cars. You know, they'd be flying down here.
Just as France had planned, the high banks and long straightaways were perfect for the heavy stock cars. Initial qualifying speeds topped an incredible 140 miles per hour.
I've heard him say this, that he wanted the cars up where everybody could see them on the banks. He wanted to let them go, whatever their ability was, that the driver controlled the accelerator, and when you would get to see the best of everything.
Bill France loved a good show, and the first Daytona 500 was his best performance to date. There were no cautions, 33 lead changes, and a more dramatic ending than Bill himself could have written.
3 cars got hung up, Diddy and Beauchamp and Joe Weatherly, but Joe Weatherly was a lap down. Well, and we knew that. But he got caught in the draft, and first thing you know, it was a 3-car draft. And then when they came back on the last lap, they come back 3 abreast. And you know, we stand in the pits, and we thought Daddy won the race.
The race was so close, even NASCAR officials couldn't make the call. They named Beauchamp the unofficial winner, but asked the press for all available photographs of the finish.
we go out, and they didn't have a winner's circle. They just all stopped out in the grass area and the deal. So we went out there and just tickled to death, thought something had really happened. And then standing there, said, man, patting each other on the back like we won the race. And they come by and said, sorry, y'all were in second.
Photographs later proved that Petty's number 42 crossed the finish line inches ahead of Beauchamp in number 73. It took 3 days for Petty to be declared the winner. Beauchamp had stolen the kisses, but Petty took home the trophy and the $19,000 first prize. Joining Lee in that race was his 21-year-old son, Richard, in a pop-top Oldsmobile. That's because this was a sweepstakes race, meaning cars from NASCAR's short-lived convertible series were also eligible.
The hardtop started on the inside, and the convertible started on the outside road. And they threw the green flag, and I'd jump in behind one of the hardtops and get me one of these good drafts, run about 7 or 8 laps and blow the engine up, because I was used to running 130 mile an hour. All of a sudden, the car was having to run 140 mile an hour, and we wasn't geared right for that particular running, and so I blew it up.
Richard wasn't the only driver who noticed the wind playing tricks with the cars, but it was a year later in the second Daytona 500 when, for the first time, the art of drafting would determine the winner.
And one day I was out playing around, and Cotton Owens and Jack Smith come by, hooked up in a drag. They thought their cars was even because they could run with each other, But I jumped on them, and when I did, all of a sudden I could run with them. And I was like 10 mile an hour faster than I was by myself.
After his experience in practice, Johnson determined that come Sunday, he'd be glued to those faster Pontiacs.
And that's what I did all day long. I hitched rides from one car to the next. When I'd drop off somebody going to pits that I was drafting on, I'd just fall in behind the next car that come along was faster than I was and hang on all day long.
Junior's drafting strategy kept him near the front all day, but as it turned out, it was the drafting of Jack Smith in the Bud Moore car that made the difference.
We ran pretty good in the race, was running real good, and we broke a right front hub. So we came in on the pit stop and was changing the hub, and we were the first one to ever run a two-way radios in the car. Bobby Johns was leading the race, late in the race, and we had got back in. We were running real good. And Smokey Unick walked over to me, and he says, "Can you talk to Jack on that radio?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well," said, "he's coming up there on Bobby Johns." Says, "How about having him to pick him up and tow him, because Junior's coming real fast in that Chevrolet." Anyway, we picked him up, and we got to towing Bobby Johns, and they got to running so fast till going off turn 2, they sucked the back glass out of the car Bobby Johns was driving and spun out, and it cost him the race.
I guess that was probably the first time that anybody knew anything about the aerodynamics of picking the back of the car. All of a sudden, I seen the back of his car come up off the ground, and when it did, it just started turning down through the dirty wind.
Johnson could never top his unusual Daytona victory, but he remained a dominant driver until his retirement in 1966. His mountain charm and reckless style made him a favorite with the fans, if not the other drivers.
We had some knockdown, drag-out duels on the racetrack. We really did. He was a hard charger. When the green flag dropped, he drove that car as hard as it would go from start to finish, or as long as the car would last.
From mountain moonshiner to racing champion, a story writer Tom Wolfe couldn't pass up.
He's a coon hunter, a rich man, an ex-whiskey runner, a good old boy who hard charges stock cars 175 miles an hour. Mother dog, he's the lead-footed chicken farmer from Rhonda, the true vision of the New South.
In his 1965 article, Wolfe dubbed Johnson the last American hero. His nearsighted vision of Southern culture did little to dispel the redneck stereotype, but the publicity was great for NASCAR, and it made Junior Johnson a legend. During a decade of driving, Junior Johnson started 311 Grand National races. He won 50 of them. As for the publicity, well, Junior never cared much for it. Bill France wasn't the only racing entrepreneur who saw the future in the superspeedway. In June of 1960, promoter Bruton Smith and veteran driver Curtis Turner held the first event at the Charlotte Motor Speedway. It was hyped as the world's longest and most grueling late-model stock car race, the inaugural World 600.
track was not a good base put down. The track come all apart, and there was big potholes in it. And they had our cars. We were able to put chicken wire on a rack in front of the windshield. And NASCAR went and bought some truck flaps, mud flaps from a place in Charlotte. We had to bolt. They cut them in half, and we bolted them behind on the rear bumper behind the rear tires. And then you had a rack in front of the grill to keep the asphalt from coming through the radiator.
Meanwhile, another 1.5 mile super track was nearing completion, the Atlanta International Speedway. On July 31st, 1960, Fireball Roberts shot past Cotton Owens with just 12 laps left to win the first Dixie 300.
Back then, we were running probably 45 to 50 races, and sometimes 55 Grand National races a year, and we were running all the short tracks and the half a miles, the third of miles, and besides what major speedways we had. So as Charlotte came along, they built a racetrack, and then Atlanta, and then Rockingham, as they all came along and started building the major speedways, as it all started falling together, and things went to getting the better, and we got more prize money and got more sponsors into the race.
In 1963, NASCAR racing returned to a much more unusual big track, the 2.7-mile road course at Riverside, California.
Stock car racing was almost inherently at that time looked upon as a southern sport. That's in the South, and that's what they do in the South, and that expanded a market area. It opened it up into a population that had never experienced this kind of motorsports racing.
Many of the Grand National pilots looked lost on the twisting road course. Most just couldn't get used to driving clockwise and turning right. Not surprisingly, road course veteran Dan Gurney took the checkered. From 1963 to 1968, he won 5 of the 6 races held at Riverside. As the tracks were changing, so were the men who raced on them. Old jockeys like Herb Thomas, Cotton Owens, and Fonty Flock turned in their silks. One of the greatest losses came in a Daytona qualifier in 1961. Lee Petty and Johnny Beauchamp, the same men who orchestrated the track's first fabulous finish, spun in turn 3 and sailed up and over the guardrail. Beauchamp never raced again. Petty returned to racing briefly, but soon retired due to his injuries.
He said, "You all going home," and talking to my brother and myself, and go to town, buy another car, and get started on, get another car built. And said, "Me and your mother will be home. We'll probably be home by Friday." And he's all doped up. He doesn't know what's going on anyway. He's laying there all beat up. And I said, "Okay." So we take off, and Friday in 4 months he finally comes home. I mean, they kept him down there 4 months before they was able to get him out. So he was hurt up pretty bad.
Tragedy turned to controversy later that year when NASCAR suffered its first labor crisis.
Turner and Weatherly and Bruton were in trouble with Charlotte Motor Speedway. They had to repave it, so they got in a lot of financial troubles. And I guess Turner was going to borrow money from the Teamsters to get the Speedway out of hock. And like I say, this is everything, the word that went around. And in order for the Teamsters to loan them money, they wanted to organize the race drivers into the union.
For Turner, the timing seemed right. While the sport was expanding, even some of the better drivers struggled to make meal money.
Of course, we always wanted to have increased prize money and better conditions to race under, but Bill France and his group were doing the best they could. Sometimes we couldn't see that from our side of the sport, but we were looking for improvements.
Turner gained the support of some of the top drivers, including Joe Weatherly, Fireball Roberts, and Tim Flock. Bill France was furious. He quickly called an emergency meeting with the drivers.
And he was serious about he was going to protect NASCAR any way he had to. And that anybody who wanted to run this race could, anybody that didn't could leave, but there's going to be no Teamsters involved in it.
France was clear. No Teamster would ever race in his NASCAR. Most of the union supporters backed down, leaving only Turner and Flock to face France's wrath. Big Bill moved swiftly and banned the two drivers for life. Two of NASCAR's finest were gone.
I think that's one reason that NASCAR has grown as much as it has over the years and has built the respect that it has, is because that France chose to run the thing himself. We've seen other racing organizations that are run by committees, and they just don't get along as well and don't grow as well as NASCAR has.
As the old veterans fell off the pace, younger drivers took their place up front. Lee Petty won his third NASCAR championship in 1959. His son Richard almost won his first in 1960, coming in a close second to Rex White. Then after Lee's crash, Richard was forced to take the reins at the Petty stable.
I was like 23 years old. My mother and father had always run the business. Daddy did the engineer and told us what to do on the cars. Mother took care of all the bills and all this kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, my brother and myself were put into the situation of running Petty Enterprises and looking after the Petty family.
But the young Petty wasn't the only newcomer on the tracks. Another second-generation driver, Buddy Baker, began trying his hand, as did Fred Lorenzen, David Pearson, and Nelson Stacy. In '61, Stacy shocked the veterans by winning the Southern 500 in only his 13th race. But it was another young driver who would be the real surprise of 1961. In only his third season, Ned Jarrett won the NASCAR championship. Banking on consistency, he finished in the top 10 in 34 of 46 races.
I think the key to the success in winning the championship in 1961 was my style of driving and not punishing the car so much that we were sitting on the sidelines too much at the end of the race. You know, the point system today rewards consistency. I would say that the point system that was in effect back in those days rewarded consistency even more, because I only won one race in winning the championship in 1961. That's not the way I wanted to do it, and I vowed to myself that I would win it again and would win more races and feel better about it.
Jarrett got his chance to feel better in 1965. This time he won 13 races and his second Grand National Championship.
We had been with Ford, 1965 was our third year with them, and had helped to develop some of the things that would help to make better race cars out of them, and as a result we continued to have more confidence in driving harder, and of course we had associated ourselves at that time with Bondi Long in Camden, South Carolina, and we had put together a good team, a good group of people who had experience, knew what it took to run up front and also to win the championship.
It was also in 1965 at Darlington that Ned learned never to doubt a preacher's premonition.
I was standing in the pits at Darlington going over the strategy of the race with the crew, and a gentleman walked up and introduced himself as a minister from Orangeburg, South Carolina, and he said, "Ned," he said, "I got a very special feeling that you're going to win this race today," and he said, "I want you to know that." And he said, "I also want you to know that 2 years ago," said, "I had this very same feeling," and he said, "I went up to Fireball Roberts and told him the same thing that I'm telling you before the race, and sure enough, Fireball won that race."
Early in the race, many of the top competitors were taken out by accidents, like this one that sent Cale Yarborough sailing over the guardrail. Late in the race, Jarrett's car had overheating problems. Ned was third, well behind Fred Lorenzen and Darrell Derringer. Miraculously, within 6 laps, both their cars had mechanical problems. Ned nursed his Ford through the remaining miles to win the Southern 500.
That was one of the races that I had set a goal to win. It was the oldest 500-mile stock car race, and I still believe is run on the toughest track there is, and it gives you a great feeling of accomplishment to win there.
Ned Jarrett's career moved faster than his number 11 Ford. It started when he decided to buy one of Junior Johnson's used race cars with a bad check.
They wanted $2,000 for it, and there was a race at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina on Saturday night, and one at Charlotte at an old fairgrounds track, a half-mile dirt track, on Sunday afternoon, and each of those races paid $950. And I said, I'll go win both of those races, and that's $1,900, and I can scrape up that other $100 before the bank opens on Monday morning. Well, they laughed, but I was serious.
Always a believer, Jarrett did just that. He won the 100-miler at Myrtle Beach despite getting severe cuts on his hands from a bad steering wheel. Then he worked all night to prepare for the next race, leaving him in no shape to drive.
We got in the race at Charlotte, and I was running along in 4th place, and everything was looking good. But fortunately, Junior Johnson was driving Wood Brothers' car, and he had a problem with it. And a caution came out, so I wheeled in and got Junior behind the wheel of my car, and he went on and won the race. So we did have the $1,900 at the end to cover the check. So that's really how I got into the Grand National Racing.
Before his sudden retirement in 1966, Ned Jarrett had raced in 352 Grand National events. He won 50 of them, the same number as his friend and arch rival, Junior Johnson. Along with the super speedways, another big change came to NASCAR in the early 60s, open factory sponsorship.
The fans came as much to watch the brand of car as they did the driver, because I know up where I lived in the Carolinas, you didn't hear somebody say, old David Pearson's going to take that, go out and wear out Richard Petty or whatever. It was, Pearson will take that old Ford or Pontiac or whatever he's running, and he'll whip that Plymouth or Dodge that Richard Petty's driving.
When it went over, when it started getting publicity, when it started getting pictures in the paper, when it started making headlines in some sports section, then you saw the factors say, look, we should look into that. We should see what's going on.
Feeling that involvement in such a reckless and dangerous sport made for bad press, the American manufacturers had jointly agreed to get out of racing in 1957. The fact is, their support simply moved underground. They continued to quietly funnel parts and know-how to the top teams. Then in 1962, Ford announced it was breaking the silence.
They announced that they were going to have 4 teams starting in 1963, and I was flattered that they came to me to be one of those 4 teams and that they would offer the technical assistance and some money. Then it was $2,000 per race for any event that was 250 miles or longer. There were 17 of those events back then, so we had $34,000 in cash. That was our sponsorship money plus the cars and the parts that Ford Motor Company would offer.
Those parts for the factory Ford teams made their first stop at the shops of Holman Moody in Charlotte, North Carolina. No one was better at turning a stock car into a race car.
Back then, you were just about running stock cars. And that's what happened in Holman Moody. Me, mostly myself, come up with all the stuff with the spindle and steering linkage and, heavy-duty stuff so somebody didn't get hurt. So it just didn't break. And to start with it, they quite didn't want to go along with that because they were running stock cars. But finally, we got them to see, the stock cars are fine. When you keep breaking them all day, by and by, you don't have a show, half the field's gone.
Ford's leap back in the racing game paid off immediately. Ford won 23 races in 1963 compared with only 6 the year before. Their star player was Holman Moody's new golden boy, Fred Lorenzen.
He was one of those guys you just had to keep cool down all the time. He used to get mad at me all the time. I give him hell about something, when he stopped and give him a drink of water and tell him what he's doing wrong or something, and he'd get mad and throw the water at you and he'd all upset,
Nothing could cool down Freddie Lorenzen in 1963. He finished in the top 5 in 21 races and won 6 of them. He became the first driver ever to win more than $100,000 in a single season. What's more impressive, he did it in only 29 starts, as Ford didn't sponsor him in the short 100-mile events.
Fred Lorenzen, to make a long story short, was probably one of the most nervous racers I've ever known or been around or been close to, but I had a heart bigger than an automobile. He was all heart, all serious, and smart.
A former USAC champion, Lorenzen moved south in 1960 and within a year had landed the Holman Moody ride. Despite their frequent disagreements, he credits much of his early success to Moody, including his first big win in 1961 at Darlington.
He kept trying to pass Turner down, and he couldn't get by after Turner shut him off up in a wall. And I had already bugged him about that, I said, you just keep playing like a dumb kid going up there and he'll shut you off. And when there's a lap or something to go, just pull that stuff when he moves up, dive underneath him and move him out of there. And he did that, and Turner was so mad that after Freddie won the race, he went over and ran him in the backstretch.
Ford's domination on the super speedways didn't go unnoticed in the Chrysler camp. Engineers worked overtime. The result was an updated version of the hemispherical combustion engine, the Hemi.
Even though I'd finished some pretty good races at Daytona, it was strictly from the drafting standpoint. You go to the other races, then you didn't have the power to really run good. Short tracks, you just out-handle the cars, and you was able to win some races. But when we got the Hemi in '64 and went to Daytona, then, you know, right off the bat, we was as fast as anybody had ever been.
Petty dominated the 500 for his first super speedway win. Plymouths took the first 3 spots, and the factory car wars were on. Petty would ride his Hemi to 8 more wins and his first Grand National Championship.
We had more experience with the Chrysler cars than anybody had up to that time. There was a lot of people jumped on, wanted to have the Hemis and went into the Chrysler business because they knew there was good race cars, but they didn't have the experience of working on the cars and working on the chassis and stuff.
The eventual loser in the battle of the Big Three was General Motors. From 1960 to '62, they excelled in providing secretive support for the dominant Pontiacs. But as Ford and Chrysler surfaced, GM retreated.
Joe Weatherly started driving for me in 1961. Well, we won the championship. Back then it was the Grand National Championship in 1962 and 1963. We were running a Pontiac. And we run Pontiac 61, 62, and we got up to about the middle of 63, and Pontiac had already told us that they would not be back next year, that they were pulling out their support and all this.
For Joe Weatherly, GM's pullout could have been disastrous. He won the championship in convincing fashion in '62, but in '63, Bud Moore told Joe he would only prepare his Pontiac for the major races. Weatherly would not be discouraged. He proceeded to bum rides from lesser-known car owners for the small events. In all, he drove for 10 different teams in 53 races. He squeaked by Richard Petty for his second NASCAR crown.
Little Joe was kind of a superstitious person. He had a pair of tennis shoes that needed to belong in the scrap barrel a long time ago, but he was sentimental to those shoes. He was real superstitious. If you threw a peanut in his car, he would not get in it until it was cleaned out.
They all named him the clown prince of racing in NASCAR and this stuff, and he's always liked to pull jokes on everybody. And
More Weatherly and Turner, it used to be the driver could collect the money. When they collected the money, they kept going with it. We had to get it fixed, so we collected the money. We run a half a year and never get any money. They just take it and go home.
But when it come time to sit down in that race car, when they dropped that green flag, now it was all business. And Joe won a lot of races, and he was considered one of the greatest race drivers there ever was in NASCAR, and I consider him that myself.
Joe Weatherly was determined to run his absolute best at every race. Ironically, it could have been that drive that ended his career and his life. At Riverside in 1964, Joe fell out with transmission problems. He insisted the crew fix the car and get him back on the track.
We were only a couple of laps down, and Joe was really running hard. And, he went into turn 5, and he lost the right front wheel cylinder. And the car got airborne, got in the wall going into turn 6. And I think right today, if we'd had the safety net on the side, the window, I think Joe would still be here today. The situation, he got into a concrete wall and his head hit the wall.
Though his career was cut short, Joe Weatherly scraped his way to 25 victories, many of them in second-rate equipment. He also won 2 straight NASCAR championships, and one thing is sure, the Clown Prince always had fun in the process. Weatherly's death was the beginning of one of the most tragic seasons in NASCAR history. 4 months later, in the World 600, Ned Jarrett, Junior Johnson, and Fireball Roberts crashed. Fireball's car flipped over and flaming gasoline engulfed the cockpit.
My car remained upright all through this, and the cars landed, I guess, about 30 feet apart. So I immediately got out of my car and went over to see if I could help him. And he was in the process of coming out of his car. He had already unbuckled his seatbelt and shoulder harness and was trying to crawl out, but his shoe apparently had gotten caught on something and was having a little bit of a struggle. So I just reached around his shoulders and jerked him and pulled him out, because remember, it ripped the top part of his shoe off.
Roberts was burned severely. He died 2 months later from complications. Sadly, Fireball had confided to friends that he was thinking of retiring after that fateful race.
And he said, I'm going back to Charlotte, and I'm going to drive that race. And he said, I've already talked to Ford, and they're going to let me out of the contract. And he said that, I don't want to run that race, he said, but I really feel like I should, finish it up because I qualified the car and all. But he said, after I qualified the car, I had a long talk with myself and decided to get the hell out of this thing.
The tragedies of '64 weren't over yet. In September, again at Charlotte, one of the sport's most popular young drivers, Jimmy Pardue, was killed during a tire test. By then, many drivers were calling for steps to improve safety. The Roberts accident prompted the use of fire-preventative fuel cells, and Goodyear developed the inner liner tire, which prevents loss of control in a blowout. But by far the biggest change came when NASCAR banned the Hemi engine.
They wanted to do something about not having that automobile so much better than the rest of them, because it was a little car compared to the rest of them. If you look back then, the Galaxy was a 4,200-pound car and a big, bulky thing, big flat nose on it. Chevrolet wasn't much better.
The old man said, look, we love Chrysler, and we love General Motors, and we love Ford, and we have friends in all of yours, but we love NASCAR the most. And in order for NASCAR to survive, we got to sell tickets, and we got to please the promoters around the country. And to please them, to sell the tickets, we must have close competition.
When NASCAR pulled the Hemi, Chrysler pulled out of NASCAR, taking some of the most popular drivers with it. Paul Goldsmith, David Pearson, and Bobby Isaac joined the USAC Tour, while Richard Petty took his Hemi drag racing.
We had been with Chrysler all those years and stuff, and so we were their racing team, basically. And so they said, okay, you can't do that, we'll go drag racing. So we went drag racing for probably 6 or 7 months, and then NASCAR finally relented that there wasn't nothing but Fords running, and the crowds were starting to fall off and all this stuff. So they said, okay, y'all can run anything from a mile down. You can't run the big super speedways, but you could run a mile. So they just opened up Rockingham. So we got to run Rockingham, and then we ran 13 short tracks, I think, that particular year.
Without the Chrysler contingent, many of the fans stayed home. Besides allowing the Hemi back on short tracks, Bill France did something else to appease the masses. He repealed his lifelong suspension of Curtis Turner. Turner came back to NASCAR wide open. In only his 5th race, he won the American 500, the first race ever held on the brand new track at Rockingham.
I like to compete against Fireball. I also like to compete against Curtis. Curtis was the type of race driver that whatever he had to do to beat you, he'd go deeper, farther than anybody to try to make sure he beat you. I like that.
For '66, France announced he was allowing the return of the Hemi. In response, Ford announced the introduction of a new overhead cam engine. Fearing the new power plants would ruin competition, NASCAR adopted weight restrictions on the new Fords. Now it was the other car makers' turn to fume. On April 15th, Ford announced its own boycott of NASCAR.
Well, we were requested by a motor company to approve an engine that isn't available to the public.
What will the long-range effect of these rules be, Bill?
Well, actually, our long-range effect is to return the sport back to the drivers and the mechanics and the independent car owners, and not let any corporation make the rules of a sport.
Suddenly, Chrysler was back and Ford was missing. The promoters were against the wall again. Clay Earls of Martinsville Speedway summed up the feeling of the track owners in this quote: We might as well plow up our racetracks and plant them with vegetable crops if we can't get assurance that the top drivers will compete in Grand National events. Ford's firm stance soon faltered when several independent drivers began putting on a show of their own. Tiger Tom Pistone took 6 top 5s in his pieced-together Ford, and Elmo Langley won 2 short-track events. But perhaps the most surprising was a young ex-modified driver in a small-block Chevelle.
Went to Oxford, Maine, and we had blown up the engine down at Bridgehampton, Long Island at the road course the Sunday before, and of course Oxford was going to be on a Tuesday night, and I was able to find a used Corvette block assembly in a Boston dealership, and bought that and went on to a little dealership to let us work on the car there right across the street from the Oxford Speedway at the time. And we worked, and we got the car ready, and got over there to the racetrack the next day, and qualified pretty good, but really dominated the event and got my first win. And what a thrill, you know, to be able to have the car perform well and then stay together, which was the big thing.
Allison's win was the first for a Chevy in 3 years. He soon took 2 more victories, taking advantage of a rule that allowed the smaller engine cars to carry less total weight. Meanwhile, the former Ford loyalists began to break ranks. Curtis Turner joined with Smokey Unick to field a Chevy, and Ned Jarrett began driving independent Fords. His unexpected retirement at season's end began an exodus of famous Ford drivers.
In '66, about the time that I retired, Junior Johnson retired, Fred Lorenzen retired within a relatively short period of time, and Marvin Panch. So the sport was losing some names that had been built up pretty good over the years, and you wondered, well, you know, can it survive all of this? But it has, and in fact it survived and progressed.
By season's end, the Ford-sponsored cars were back at the track. The second boycott in as many seasons was busted. And while Ford came out the loser, the big winner was a highly touted driver from South Carolina. As Ford protested, David Pearson wheeled his Cotton Owens Dodge to an incredible 15 victories and his first Grand National Championship. In 1967, the Fords began the season dominating the super speedways, with drivers like Cale Yarborough and David Pearson, who had taken over the Holman Moody ride left by Fred Lorenzen. But the bulk of the schedule was still made up of short races on short tracks, and there the Chryslers shined, especially the Petty Plymouth.
'67 was just a weird year. We started off at Daytona, and I think 7th was the best we could run down there. We just got blown away. But we started and we won a couple of 3 races, and then we'd lose a race or 2, and then you'd come back and win another one. And we wasn't doing anything different than what we'd been doing. It just all fell together.
Whatever the reason, Richard Petty was unstoppable. By the midway point, the 30-year-old from Level Cross had won 11 times, including wins at Darlington and Rockingham. Later, he set a NASCAR record with 10 straight victories and ended with an unbelievable 27 for the season.
I guess you'd have to say Richard Petty was probably one of the first naturals to come along. You know, he's probably did more to upgrade our sport than any other driver.
Richard Petty was never a bad driver. We were racing on lots of little tracks, which he was good on. And he had good, strong factory support. And the Pettys at that time had some good help. They were a close family-oriented team.
Him winning 10 in a row and winning a total of 27 races was not all bad for the sport. In fact, I think it was good for the sport. I think we need a rabbit, so to speak. You need a person for someone to chase. It gives the media more to play off of. And so I don't think that it was all that bad for the sport.
During that season, Petty passed his father Lee and moved into first place in all-time Grand National wins. He still holds that honor today. Around the same time, someone decided to call him King. That honor still holds as well.
I think it was 3 or 4 of the reporters out talking one night, probably doing a little drinking too, But, you know, everybody had some kind of a nickname, and mine had always just been plain Richard Petty. And, you know, some of them tried to call you the Ramming Rocket or whatever. They was trying to pick something on there. And some of these boys just come up and, you know, they said, you know, Richard and then King, and he's winning everything, so they just said King Richard.
Petty's success had the Ford boys licking their wounds and looking for answers. One move was to start a new team under the direction of Fred Lorenzen. Lorenzen's choice for his new driver, Bobby Allison.
The phone rang and I answered, and this voice that I recognized said, "You're going to get a call in 2 minutes. The answer is yes, goodbye." And I realized it was Ralph Moody that had called. And I said, you know, why is he aggravating me? We're here working, you know, and it's hot and I'm sweating and we've got a lot of work to do. Why is he aggravating me? But I hung the phone up. Sure enough, it rang again. And Fred Lorenzen, this is Fred Lorenzen. Ford gave me a car. Will you drive it at Rockingham? Sure, yeah. I know the answer. The answer is yes.
Allison won that race at Rockingham and the following race as well. For 1968, Ford loaded the big cannon. Leroy Yarborough would drive Junior Johnson's number 26, and Cale Yarborough was in the seat of the number 21 Wood Brothers Mercury.
Well, Cale was just a hell for leather guy. He was always been out of shape, sideways and half turned over. I mean, this Cale Yarborough got in a car, it got the socks drove off of it because his idols was Turner and Baker and Weatherly and Fireball. That was his idols, and he had to do just like they done, and that's what made him good.
Cale drove his slope-backed Montego into victory lane 6 times. Included were wins in the Daytona 500, Virginia 500, and the Southern 500. But Ford's best Petty killer came once again from the shops of Holman Moody. The marksman was David Pearson.
You know, he's the type of guy who never very seldom tore a car up or got in problem, even short track or anything else. You know, just about always brought it home, you know, running.
And Pearson was probably one of the smoothest drivers. At Darlington, you ever watch everybody go into number one corner, try to drive in too deep, and you watch Pearson, he'd back off a little earlier, be smooth getting in the corner, and he'd get off faster, so the rest of the racetrack was faster because he got out of the corner better.
Petty and Pearson finished the season in a dead heat. Each had 16 wins with only one on a super speedway. Pearson won at Darlington and Petty at Rockingham. But it was Pearson who was more consistent and Pearson who collected the NASCAR championship. The fight for the '68 crown wasn't the first or last duel between Petty and Pearson. For years, their on-track bouts were the main event at every race.
There's nobody run first and second to each other more times than we have. In fact, we've run first and second to each other more times than most people's won races. I think he beat me 33 times and I beat him 31 times or something like that. You know what I mean? So that's 60-some races there that we won between us. And we was first and second in those races. So again, from a competitor standpoint, I never felt like that there was anybody that could do a better job in a race car than David Pearson could do, because he could win on any kind of racetrack, and anywhere you went, he was the one you had to beat.
Most of Ford's success in '68 had come with the new fastback Torinos and Mercury Montegos. They were the first successful attempt by a manufacturer to build cars with racing in mind.
I think the rules were that you had to make as many or offer as many as 500 to the public. Well, that wouldn't even be one for each dealer around the country for it to be eligible for NASCAR competition. Of course, the manufacturers took advantage of that. They'd build those 500 and sell them as muscle cars, but they were not mass-produced cars, but they were designed for race cars.
Seeing the dominance of the aerodynamic Fords, Richard Petty did the unthinkable.
And at that time, they was building the wing Dodge, and Mercury and Ford had the slope-back cars and different front ends on the cars, so they were building a special car. Plymouth was going to have to run a stock car, and I said, ain't no way that I can run a stock car against all these modified body cars. And they said, well, I said, you're a Plymouth driver and you work for us and that's what you're going to do. And I said, well, I won't work for you. If I can't have a Dodge, then I'll go somewhere else. And they said, go. So that's what we done. We went across the street and talked to Ford and they said, fine.
Petty wheeled his Ford to victory 9 times in 1969, while arch rival Pearson won 11 and took his 3rd Grand National Championship. Without the powerful Petty, Chrysler was in trouble. It was September before they finally unveiled their winged Dodge Daytona. More importantly, Chrysler announced that a Plymouth version, the Superbird, would be ready for 1970, and one of them would go to Richard Petty.
The Superbird was a great race car. Wasn't too good at Martinsville or quarter-mile racetrack and stuff, but anytime you got it on a mile or bigger with the wind resistance and wind drag and the wing made the car handle, it was a super race car.
Chrysler won 38 of the 48 races held in 1970, although not all were in the exotic winged cars. The first winner in a Superbird wasn't Richard Petty after all. It was Petty's teammate, Pete Hamilton. He passed David Pearson with only 9 laps left to win the Daytona 500. But the most successful of the winged cars wasn't blue. It was the red K&K Dodge of Bobby Isaac. Isaac picked up 11 wins and almost $200,000 on the way to his first and only Grand National Championship. The win came just in time for renowned crew chief Harry Hyde.
Well, I had told my boss, he had asked me about winning a championship in NASCAR, and I told him I thought it'd take 5 years. And he said, well, you got 5 years, and that's all. If you win a championship, we'll go on. If you don't, we'll stop. Well, I accomplished that. I won the championship in 5 years.
Along with the new, faster cars came a fresh batch of places to race them.
In the late 60s and 69 and along in there are quite a few speedways being built. Texas World Speedway came into existence a year or so in that area. Also up in Michigan, the Michigan International Speedway was built.
The most exciting addition to the schedule came in September of 1969 with the opening of the Alabama International Motor Speedway, the largest and fastest racetrack in the world.
You know, they built Talladega, and it was a very, very fast racetrack, and especially with the Hemis and the engines that they had in those cars pulling 620 to 25 horsepower. The speeds were excess of 200 miles an hour, right at it, 200 miles an hour. And Goodyear didn't have a tire that could run that kind of speed. So anyway, they went down to practice and qualify and all this, and they'd run a few laps, and then the tires would come apart.
I've seen tires go through the windshields, go out the back windows, go through the grills and knock the radiators back in the engine. You know, the whole cap would come off the tires. And you're sitting out there running 200 miles an hour and just tear up anything it hit.
The tire problem became the first grievance taken up by the new Professional Drivers Association. Made up of most of the top drivers, the organization had been formed a month earlier with Richard Petty as president.
That had been going on, not really going on, but been talked about for a long time. The purses were very, very poor. Circumstances that we had to run under were very primitive, you know what I mean? No place to change clothes, no place, no showers, no decent bathrooms for us or our crews or our families.
The PDA informed Bill France they wouldn't race until the tire problems were solved.
Oh, they had all the drivers with France and Billy France and 2 or 3 with other people there in the biggest argument you ever saw in the pit area. And Cale jumping up and down and all those guys, Cale and a whole bunch of them, say, what the hell, you think we're nuts, you know?
Complicating matters for NASCAR was the tremendous pre-race buildup. Even Bill France himself got back in a race car and turned a lap of 175 miles an hour to promote his new track.
And this France here, he's got a crowd there and everything else, and they're going to boycott and not run. I guess he was mad. Imagine trying to give all those people their money back. They boycotted the race. Wow. He had reason to be mad.
What they did at that time, apologized to the people that were there and told them that they're not going to see the race they came to see. And if you hang on to your ticket stub, you can redeem it here or at Daytona before the race here next year, and we'll honor those tickets with another ticket. That was a bold statement.
As the PDA members began leaving, France filled their spots with smaller cars from the Grand Touring division. Only 13 Grand National cars remained. Only 2 were factory rides. One, the K&K Dodge of Bobby Isaac.
I called my boss, Nard Croscoff. He's dead now. And I said, what do you want me to do? These guys are pulling out here, and it's Saturday, and it's starting to get dark, and they're loading up. The big boys are pulling out, one right after the other, headed out the gate. He said, you stay and race. And if nobody's on that racetrack but you race.
The other factory car was the Ray Nichols Dodge, driven by Richard Brickhouse. Brickhouse had accepted the ride the day before when Charlie Glotzback joined the boycott. Brickhouse went on to win his first and only Grand National race in the very first Talladega 500.
It wasn't long after the Talladega walkout that PDA was busted. I guess they got to Petty first through sponsors and all, but it's not going to work. Having a driver association is proven. You can't get 10 drivers in a room and come up with anything that's going to satisfy any 2.
As for Talladega's new track, its troubled start was no indication of the future. Goodyear solved the tire problem, and NASCAR improved safety even more by mandating carburetor restrictor plates. For the Alabama 500 in 1970, all the big names were back. Pete Hamilton followed up on his Daytona triumph with another win in the Petty Superbird. Racing headlines during the 60s had been dominated by the Big Three, and so had the results on the track.
Factory support then seemed to be almost more important than the driver. If you had factory support, you could win a race. But if you had factory support and a good driver, you just won more of it.
Since re-entering the sport in '62, the factories had introduced the Hemi, the overhead cam, and the muscle cars. Their battles with NASCAR resulted in boycotts and bad press, but also moved stock car racing towards the future. Strangely, the car maker's role in that future would be limited. Before the '71 season, Chrysler sharply curtailed its NASCAR effort, and Ford got out of racing altogether.
They got into all that pollution factor that the government was jumping up and down about. And I guess the biggest thing is with the government hollering about all they were doing is spend a bunch of money racing, and they weren't spending the money taking care of the pollution factor.
They have picked some bad people to represent them that had the wrong concept of racing, that never did get out of Detroit till they sent them down here to look this racing over, and they didn't understand it. And they wouldn't listen to a common guy like myself, or maybe Dave Marcus, or maybe Junior Johnson or somebody. They didn't do that. No, they figured it all out themselves. And so they picked up their marbles and went home. And when they did, France let them go.
The factory's departure left a huge financial void, a space immediately filled by the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company.
The number one highlight in the 1970s was R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company coming in as the sponsor of the sport and bringing sports marketing to the sport. I mean, that has opened up so many avenues and still continues to do so today.
Just before the '71 season began, NASCAR announced that RJR's Winston cigarette brand would sponsor a $100,000 point fund. The money would be distributed to the top 20 drivers in the new Winston Cup Series, all the Grand National races of 250 miles or more. More importantly, RJR brought marketing expertise into stock car racing.
They really worked at it. They did it. They not only just promoted NASCAR, they helped every track in the country, whether it was a short track like Wilkesboro, that draws maybe 25,000 fans at that time, to Daytona, where they draw 100,000. The best I remember, they were the first to have a show car. It didn't look like a race car in those days. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of that first Winston Cup car. It looked like just plexiglass and an engine and a platform on it and a running board for Miss Winston to stand on, and maybe one of the drivers that rode around in the parade lap.
We couldn't race without sponsorship, so NASCAR and France and all the other promoters sort of got into the deal and started getting all the different racers sponsors and this stuff. So this is what started the where we have now, you know, $1 million sponsors to run the races right today.
Reynolds did a lot for the sport because they did put a lot of money in it in the early days. But in doing so, within 3 years, I think that got corporate America's attention to say, hey, R.J. Reynolds, one of the biggest companies in the country, is interested in stock car racing. And I think that got the attention in a lot of boardrooms around the country.
Perhaps it was appropriate that the first NASCAR Winston Cup crown went to the King. One of only 2 remaining drivers with direct factory support, Petty won 21 races, including his 3rd Daytona 500.
Pete Hamilton coming down, taking the checkers, will be headed for victory lane in just a moment, and we'll be there with him. From Alabama International Motor Speedway, this is the Motor Racing Network.
Along with the rise of the super speedways and the rise and fall of factory support, there's one other engine that powered NASCAR's success in the 60s, increasing coverage from the press and the electronic media.
It was a constant job to try to make people understand what we were doing and why we were doing it. That this was a legitimate sport and was on the rise. And it took a long time for a lot of newspapers and I guess some of the electronic media as well to accept that.
Before 1960, race reporting consisted of an obscure column in the local sports page. Fans would often wait several days for results from their hometown track.
As far as television, unless somebody got hurt or there was a spectacular accident that somebody happened to capture on film, it was almost nil. There was no coverage to speak of from the electronic media.
One of the first organized radio efforts came in the mid-60s with the advent of the Universal Racing Network and host Bob Montgomery.
They didn't interview anybody in the pits when anybody fell out or anything like that. It was just a couple of guys in the tower talking about the race. Then a little bit later, when they could hook up stationary positions on a telephone line, they could get a driver. Half the time he was mad, didn't want to come and talk about it one way or the other. And if he did, a lot of times they couldn't talk back then. I'm not saying, you know what I'm saying, they just couldn't come across. If you said, well, you wrecked out there, what happened? The guy would say, yeah, we hit the wall. That's it, just shut up. They wouldn't say what happened or anything.
For most Americans, those early radio shows were their first exposure to NASCAR. A whole new audience appeared. In 1969, the Motor Racing Network began with less than 100 local affiliates. Today, that list has grown to over 600 stations, making MRN the #1 source of racing coverage for NASCAR fans.
Richard Petty, the Randleman, North Carolina rocket, showing the way down the back straightaway. Richard within a car length of A.J. Foyt. Foyt a lap down. Richard Petty drifts up into the 3rd groove. Looking real good, real smooth. He heads through turn number 4. Richard Petty on his way to the checkered flag down toward the tri-oval. Richard Petty, Randleman, North Carolina, has won the Daytona 500 for the 3rd time.
The first live network TV of a Grand National event came in 1960. The CBS Sports Spectacular aired 2 10-mile pole position races from Daytona. After that early experiment, however, almost all TV coverage was filmed for air later.
Coverage consisted of 3 minutes here, 5 minutes there, cutting away to a football, basketball, whatever. And it was just bits and pieces in and out. But the excitement was pretty much there. 9 times out of 10, most of the stuff they showed was accidents and whatever.
The biggest promoter of NASCAR on TV was ABC's Wide World of Sports. They aired highlights from most of the major events throughout the 60s.
Well, this racetrack is altogether different from any racetrack in the country. This racetrack is a one-groove racetrack. It's the hardest racetrack to pass on, and it's just almost outdated for the speeds that we're running.
ABC's coverage was such a big hit, in 1970 the network signed a $1.3 million contract with NASCAR. ABC would carry 9 races, and 5 of them would include an hour of live coverage.
As it has with all other sports, television has popularized motorsports racing to where the interest that we're experiencing today is the derivative of the 1960 early television packaging and programming.
The old cliche, the good old days are gone, could certainly apply to NASCAR. To buy a race car with a bad check only to win enough money in one weekend to cover it would be virtually impossible today.
And back then we did it for fun more so. not too many were doing it for a living. Most everybody had a job and was racing and really for fun. And it was a fun era back. You had a lot of fun racing. Now it's all big business, and the fun's kind of gone out of it.
The great changes of the 60s destroyed some of the simple charm of the sport. That's true, but they also brought a whole new excitement, a new enthusiasm that would propel the sport into the future. Racing's attraction is speed, and in one decade, top speeds had increased from 140 to almost 200 miles per hour.
And some of the stuff that made it run better was the safety stuff. The guys weren't scared to run them. They know the wheels will stay on, and the wheels won't fly off, and the steering link ain't going to break, and just a whole bunch of stuff. And when they come up with that, if you look back and see how much the speed jumped year after year, because you had better equipment.
Improved equipment could only come from the factories, and Bill France knew it. He welcomed them into his sport, but he also knew when it was time to cut them loose.
What made NASCAR was firmness and fairness. I'm not saying that all of their things has been right down the line by the way a book would quote it, but they've done one hell of a fine job. I have to give them credit for it. We wouldn't have our sport today if it wasn't that way.
In 1972, Bill France handed the NASCAR baton to his son, Bill Jr., but not before completing the next phase of his master plan. In 1959, NASCAR held 4 races on superspeedways. In 1971, 19 races were on the big tracks. Bill France's dream had become reality. A dream of racing stock cars at top speed, up on the high banks where everyone could see. The 60s marked the most volatile decade in NASCAR's history. The period began with the opening of this speedway and ended with the opening of an even bigger track in Talladega. The superspeedway era didn't come without its price, though. In 1970, Richard Petty won the last dirt track Grand National race, and in 1972, the sport's modern era began when the Grand National schedule was shortened to just 31 races. Gone were the 100-milers, a staple of the sport's early days. No longer could a race fan work all day and still see a Grand National race before bedtime. It marked the end of an era and the end of another chapter in the NASCAR story.